Okay, as we wait on everyone to fill in, this is worse than my classes. It's like, guys, it's time to start. Do not ask me after class is over to change your tardy into an excused absence because it won't happen. Did you miss anything? Yeah, right. We'll probably make this announcement as well at the end of the panel. However, we are technically not supposed to have food and drinks. However, if you do bring something in, please make sure that you take it out behind you. I'm already in enough trouble as it is. So, the other item is that if you have not registered and picked up your name badge in your packet, please see Ms. Santos or some of our wonderful student volunteers at the back tables. I think there were still some people that I recognized who are here but had not registered, so make sure that you get that. So with no further ado, I will turn the stage over to our moderator and esteemed panelists. Ms. Fields. Where's, oh, there she is. She was signing autographs again. Thank you.
Me signing autographs, never. Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone enjoying this conference so far? Oh, that was so sorry. That's a lot better. So welcome to this session. This is going to be a deep dive from the standpoint of journalists. So if you weren't here last night, let me just tell you a little bit about myself really quickly. My name is Tammy Fields. I am the president of Central Florida Association of Black Journalists, which is a part of NABJ, National Association of Black Journalists. I'm a news anchor at Spectrum News 13 out of Orlando. I host a show called Justice for All, and I also write a weekly story about A+ teachers. Now, that's enough about me. Let me introduce our panelists. So the name of this session, Reporting on the Ground, Journalists on the State of Education in Florida. KATHRYN JOYCE, investigative editor at In These Times, a freelance investigative reporter and the author of 2 books, The Child Catchers, Rescue Trafficking, and the New Gospel of Adoption, and Quiverful, Inside the Christian Patriotic Movement. Formerly a reporter with Type Investigations and Salon, a contributing editor at The New Republic, and a contributing writer at Highline. Her work has also appeared in Mother Jones, Vanity Fair, The Marshall Project, The New York Times Magazine, Pacific Standard, Wired, and others. Please welcome KATHRYN JOYCE. Kyle Spencer, the author of Raising Them Right, the untold story of America's ultra-conservative youth movement and its plot for power. She is a frequent MSNBC contributor and former New York Times contributor who spent 20+ years as an award-winning multimedia journalist, producing stories about education, race, class, and social movements. Kyle's work has appeared in New York Magazine, Politico, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Slate, and the Christian Science Monitor. She has co-produced a Frontline segment on school segregation and has often conducted TV research and development work on topics related to young people, education, and the culture wars. Please welcome Kyle Spencer. So before we do a deep dive and I start asking some questions, I want to remind all of you in the audience that this is a two-way conversation and you will have an opportunity to ask your own questions as we've done in the other sessions. So start making a note of your questions as we go along. We also want to let you know we want to really prioritize the folks who are not panelists. So we want to make sure that the attendees get to ask questions. So keep that in mind. All right, let's get it started. KATHRYN and Kyle, and I'll let you guys kind of go back and forth with which questions you would like to answer. Oh, you know what they told me to do? They told me to come sit next to you guys.
Oh, that's good.
I had to think about it before I walked all the way over here in these hills if I was gonna have to go back. Okay. So let's talk about the role. Oh, there we go. Let's talk about the role of journalism and what it should be during times when academic freedom is under attack. What should the role of journalism be?
Sure. Does this work? Not yet.
There you go.
How about now? No? Right, sorry. How about now? Okay, for sure. I mean, I think that, journalism, our role, all of us here it's always to document, to bear witness, to do that accurately, to do that fairly. But I don't think accurately and fairly necessarily means neutrally. I think, journalists should understand that we get to do what we do because of democratic freedoms. And those are the same democratic freedoms that are at stake, in public education, in the freedom to read and access, whatever sort of information you want from a public library, any of the freedoms that we're talking about this weekend that are under attack. And I think, I feel like I'm borrowing wisdom here from media critics like Jay Rosen, but who have, pointed out that, this is an issue, I think, that we have been dealing with since 2015, at least. Journalists not really knowing how do you cover all of these developments that, are attacks on the very freedoms that allow us to do our jobs. And like, how do you kind of deal with that, with the tradition of objectivity, kind of questionable tradition at sometimes within media. And I think where I come down on like the side of journalists have to stand up for the freedoms that are aligned with the same ones that allow us to do our work. We have to be able to make that stand. And that means, defending education and defending, the freedom to read, the freedom of speech in classrooms and everywhere else.
Kyle?
What she said.
Underscore.
Yeah, underscore. So yes. And I think during this conversation, I want to be clear that I love journalists and I love journalism and I believe in that form. I'm also feeling very negatively about it right now and critically, because I guess how I would answer this question is what shouldn't you do as a journalist? And what you shouldn't do is be complicit, right? You shouldn't be part of the problem. You shouldn't be accepting as a kind of, we often talk about two-sidesism in journalism. You shouldn't accept that one side in a democracy is tyranny, right? That's not a side. And I think that we've seen journalists be unwilling and unable. And I don't think it's because they're bad people. I think it's because it's hard to know what to do in this situation. But I think there has to be a much, much clearer decision on the part of journalists and editors to accept what is, to decide what is unacceptable and not treat that like it's suddenly inside the conversation about what is okay and what is possible and what is simply an option inside a democracy. Because there are things that are not options inside of democracy, and robbing people of the right to read books is not something that's okay inside a democracy. Robbing people of free speech is not something we can do inside a democracy. Having an insurrection is not something we do inside a democracy, right? So we can talk more about that, but yeah.
How did you get involved, KATHRYN, with covering the educational wars why did you think that it was newsworthy?
Sure. Yeah, I've thought about this. Oh, thank you. I've thought about this question a lot over the last couple of years. Because the first education reporting that I did, I sort of stumbled into. I'm a journalist who has covered the right wing for about 20 years, which also means that I'm 10. But I was not an education reporter. These days, kind of those often feel like one and the same thing, because so much of where the right is in the education sector. But in 2018, I came down to Florida to report on what I was paying attention to as a new right-wing movement that was focused on fighting back against President Obama's efforts to end racial disparities in school discipline. So trying to end the school to prison pipeline through a number of different programs. And in 2018, after the tragic massacre in Parkland at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High, this turned into a real early episode, I think, of what we have now seen over the last 2 years in terms of ugly school board wars. You know, aside from the tragedy, there was this kind of political contest that grew up. Obviously, we saw all of these students kind of rise up in this really powerful, anti-gun violence movement. And in response to that, a number of right-wing actors started this really coordinated attack to basically say, it wasn't guns, it was the Obama administration and the way that they tried to, lower arrest and suspension rates in public schools that were leading to these really gross racial disparities in discipline. And it was the same sorts of things that we started seeing in 2021 in terms of really nasty school board fights, extremely kind of personal, ugly politics that started, and also like really tapping into profound racial resentments. And it was also orchestrated by the same people. The think tank person who came down to Parkland and spent about a year there kind of working to foment this into a mass movement was from the Manhattan Institute, which I think, as everybody else has paid attention to, another guy from the Manhattan Institute who has been making a lot of noise in the last couple of years. So in 2021, particularly, whenever, the nasty school board wars started, during, over kind of COVID pandemic, health protections and precautions, and then moving on to the moral panic about CRT and everything else that has followed from that. I feel like it's followed the same sort of playbook. It's just been a lot more kind of successful on a national level. But it has made me think, that all of these are this sort of shock doctrine. When Dr. McLean was talking this morning about kind of how, the right has been both kind of, nurturing and growing these movements of resentment, and then also benefiting from them. I feel like we have been seeing that in waves for, 5-6 years now, at least.
Kyle?
So I was writing about education mostly for the New York Times, and I was on and off college campuses all over the country, particularly on big state campuses. And I knew that there was a storyline. We all know there's a storyline that campuses have been overtaken by woke culture, by intolerant liberals, by Marxists. And I wasn't seeing that on these college campuses. What I was seeing was very active, very well-funded right-wing groups that were in some cases kind of terrorizing other students. Groups like Turning Point USA, Young Americans for Liberty, on and on. The group that really got me thinking about this presence of these groups was a campus carry group. And for those of you, I think some people know these campus carry groups, but these are the groups, the student facing groups that are trying to push gun ownership, gun carry on college campuses, so that you would literally be sitting in math class next to somebody. If these groups had their way, you would sit in math class next to someone who was carrying had a military grade weapon on their desk, and so I started to think about like who was funding this. And it turned out, of course, that Gun Owners of America, which makes the NRA look like it's left wing, they were funding this. And I thought there've got to be a lot of other groups that are funding these different outfits on these campuses, and found that to be the case. And then decided to sort of write a lot about that.
How can teachers, academics, administrators help to get coverage of issues that they're dealing with? And how can they help journalists get the story right? KATHRYN?
Yeah. Well, talk to us, and many of you do. I think teachers and professors are being so brave when they talk to the press. A lot of people are doing it, under circumstances that I am definitely not facing if I was speaking out about something. So when people do that, it's heroic. It's amazing. It's also not always possible to speak on the record, and that doesn't mean that you still can't talk to journalists. I think most journalists are, really honorable, really committed to the ethics of their profession. And if you need to talk to people on background or off the record because there's something going on that should be covered as a story, but you are not in a situation, where you can put your name to that right now, that's understandable. And I think, I would ask you guys as well, but I would think, every journalist I know would honor a promise to protect your confidentiality. And, you have agency here too. You can ask to talk to people just informally and off the record to begin, to say kind of like, what are you looking at? How would you want to use this, to kind of figure out what kind of ground rules you are working with, when you talk on background or off the record, which are two kind of distinct things in wonky ways that we don't need to get into here. But yeah, I think you can reach out to them, be like, I'm ready to go on the record and blow this up, or there's something that you need to be looking into. And I can, give you the lay of the land.
Kyle, what are your thoughts?
So I have a couple thoughts about this. Journalists are your allies on this, right? So you should treat them as such. A lot of journalists right now are young. These are beats that are often new to them, and you can help educate them, and they really need it and they really want it. And in my experience, are very receptive. So if you're presenting stories to journalists, you're calling them up and saying, I have something I think you should write about. You should also be really comfortable giving them historical background, I have given journalists, have you read Dark Money, Jane Mayer's Dark Money? Have you read Nancy's book, Democracy in Chains? Like, give them books to read, give them background, give them history. Journalists are trafficking in daily stories, and they don't often have the ability to do that kind of research. So that would be something I would highly suggest. I'd also say that you really have to be vigilant with journalists now and with editors about stuff you're seeing that's inaccurate, that you understand is a kind of two-sidesism that actually leads to sort of lies about what's going on. And so you can first talk to journalists about it and to, explore with them where you think a story is being reported inaccurately or ineffectively. And then if you need to, go higher up and talk to editors. And again, this is not individual, anything about particular journalists. It's just really putting pressure on the press to report these, but to not be manipulated by the marketing of the radical right, which is marketing of the radical right is so powerful and so good. And what journalists are starting to do is fall for it way too much.
I know that Nancy said earlier, these are stories that the media is not covering. And I don't know any journalist who, if you say, you all aren't covering this, why aren't you covering this? That doesn't perk up and say, well, can you tell, what is it that we need to be covering? Okay, because it is, they take it personal.
Mhm.
Yeah. What are the surprising or significant things that you've learned during these investigations that you've conducted to cover the issues that we're talking about? What are some of the things that have really surprised you, KATHRYN?
Well, I think other people have touched on this already, or kind of mentioned, part of this, which is a pattern that I've seen, which is I was not prepared for the people on the right who are kind of waging this war to explain what they are doing so clearly, to just admit. It's with Christopher Rufo, it's almost seems like a bit of a fetish to be like, I am going to do this, I am doing this, I just did this. There's a bit of a power play aspect to it. But I also think, that doesn't mean that we should ignore, when they are kind of laying out their strategy in this sort of kind of bragging way of, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do to you, and then I'm going to do it, and then I'm going to remind you that I just did it. They are also explaining what their strategy is. So Nancy had one of the quotes up there from when Rufo spoke at Hillsdale in early 2022, where he was talking about the way to get to universal school choice is to foster this sense of universal distrust of public schools, paraphrasing. That's one thing, but he's also done it, and a lot of other right-wing leaders have been doing it in as explicit terms. Richard Corcoran, before he was running New College, went up to Hillsdale and talked about how we are going to win the war in education. Doing this well before a lot of us were paying attention to the name Hillsdale, before a lot of us were paying attention to the way in which schools were becoming a really kind of wholesale battleground. But I think one of the times I found that this was really interesting and obvious was after the New College hostile takeover earlier this year, when a guy named Darren Beatty, who was a former Trump speechwriter, he has a website that published kind of this long analysis of what was happening at New College, and included this praise for the idea that the right was putting on this master class in showing how to overwhelm your enemy by hitting them in so many different ways at once. That the thing, what was going on at New College was happening at the very same time as, what was going on with the AP class and the rejection of that, and everything else that has been going on in Florida schools in particular, over the last 2 years. But I think we need to keep that in mind, that there is, and the kicker there is that that is intending to overwhelm by having so many different targets all at once.
Any surprises for you?
Yeah, I thought there was a line. I thought there was a line that these right wingers would not cross. And when I was writing my book, I was following Turning Point and some of these other groups, and I did not expect them to start to endorse violence. I didn't expect them to start to denounce democracy. That was really what surprised me. I think that we've seen this nationally, right? We've seen this with these organizations. The willingness to kind of blow it all up. I think I didn't expect that. I didn't think that I think I had some sense that these folks wanted to work inside of a democracy. I didn't expect them to be willing to trash democracy and create something else. So when we talk about these libertarians, I understood that they liked skeletal government. I understood that they didn't want, the Department of Education. They didn't want, the EPA. But I didn't think that they wanted this kind of chaos. And so that was very shocking to me. And I think now I'm seeing it a lot with Moms for Liberty. I just did not expect these women to pose as concerned mothers. And I expected them to perhaps then have views I didn't like. I didn't expect them to become terrorists, to become actually violent and threatening to people, to ally themselves with the Proud Boys and to go to school board meetings and have armed allies outside. I don't think any of us expected that. And I think this conversation that we've been having in this room is, do these people believe in anything? Like, do they have these ideas? And, or is it just a power money grab? And I think I think that I believed in some way that there was a conservative ideology and that I understood what it was. And even if I even thought it was dangerous, that it existed. And I'm increasingly feeling like the ideology has been thrown out the window, and the ideology is just a front for power and a destruction of democracy as we know it.
Well, we talked about how teachers, academics, and administrators can get coverage, but what are the challenges once you get into the weeds of it to cover a story about education or something specific? What are the challenges you face here in Florida and nationally, if any, to get that story out, printed, published?
Yeah, I mean, I think lack of access can be a pretty key challenge, but that is different story to story and district to district or school to school. So, I think being able to talk to the people who are involved obviously is a pretty key concern. Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes, trying to understand, I mean, I'm not a daily news journalist. I tend to be a long form writer. So I have the luxury of time that a lot of journalists do not have. And so I, often am tending to try to look at patterns that are showing up in different districts or in different states. And, I mean, so on that kind of individual level, like, learning the different context in which these things are happening, because I think we are seeing, cookie cutter campaigns happen around the country, but they are also happening in, specific locations with their own specific history, their own kind of specific trigger points and local politics and all of that. So, I mean, I think it's, the pretty standard challenge of, trying to understand what's the lay of the land when you're going somewhere new.
Pushback when you cover these stories?
you're saying, do you get pushback or yeah. So I would say the thing that I think is most challenging is, again, this violence issue that I didn't expect this. And what you're seeing now and has been seeing for a while is a willingness to stick, undercover cops on journalists. I mean, you actually are seeing this. If you are covering stories, writing books about things that these guys don't want out there, the physical intimidation, you have stories of folks literally, the Kochs hiring people to stand outside your house to inundate you with social media harassment. That to me is really a huge challenge to covering this. When I worked on my book, I was thinking, I'm really lucky I live in New York City because they can stick someone outside my house in a car and I'll be like, whatever, there are a lot of cars out there. But then I had to think about that. I had to, spent a ton of money on insurance because I was concerned I was going to be sued. So that's another kind of harassment, suing. Efforts to destroy the reputation of journalists. If you cover stories and really reveal things they don't want out there, they will go after your reputation. And then there is the mental health of journalists. And I'm hearing this with state legislators who are inside these, inside these government offices and living and working with right-wing radical legislators, and their mental health is suffering. And I think as a journalist, and I've also talked quite a bit with other journalists and people who collect data, and it is very demoralizing and depressing and scary and frightening to cover the stuff endlessly and to spend time with these people and to research. And so I would say the mental health is a big challenge. And I think newsrooms need to recognize this and just help and support journalists who are covering this type of thing.
So we talked about, go ahead. Do you have
I just want to say, I have to talk to you about insurance because when I tried to get it before my last book came out, I was told I could be insured for libel lawsuits if I wrote about cookbooks.
Yeah. I have an insurer for you.
You talked about the fear that journalists have, but let's talk about the fear, if you have noticed it, when it comes to superintendents, administrators, or teachers to be willing to talk either on the record or off the record about stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a real fear. I think it's probably a lot of times a fear that makes sense. And some people, I think, kind of will push through and decide to speak out anyway. But, there's a lot of people who are not in a position where they can do that for one reason or another. But yeah, I think it's true. Some, I was working on a story looking at Sarasota in the spring, and it is another place where people who live there feel like they are kind of at ground zero of a lot of stuff that's going on. And it's interesting, I think, to recognize as a side note that a lot of people feel like they are at ground zero. And I think probably accurately, it probably feels like it's probably true that there are a number of ground zeros. But Sarasota is one of the places where a school board got flipped and a superintendent got pushed out. And he had tremendous public support behind him, nearly unanimous support from district staff. I think something like 97% of staff who answered a survey in the Sarasota Educators Union supported his staying. Really just kind of an outpouring of public support. And I was writing about this and wanted to include his perspective, and he had been pretty outspoken in some of his final meetings, before he stepped down. But yeah, I was not able to speak to him. And I guess I don't have a moral to that other than it's definitely a complicated time. And I think it's a really fraught time for educators in Florida, obviously. That's why we're here. But I feel like to date, it has been easier to speak to teachers than administrators. And I don't quite know why that is.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts, Kyle? How do you get around it?
Yeah, so I'd say that something that Catherine said, and I'm going to reiterate it, we really pride ourselves on protecting people. So you really can trust journalists. You can negotiate, you know, so I'm reiterating that. The other thing I want to say is if you don't want to, you know, what you can say off the record and the background you can give is so important and so powerful. So don't discount that. We can use it, we can build on it, we can find someone to say it on the record if we know it's out there. The other thing is documents, getting us stuff in writing, getting us pamphlets, getting us recordings, getting that stuff is so precious to us because we can't just say somebody said something. And if you don't want to say it, but you have some document, you can get it to us. And journalists now working in Signal, we're working in lots of different ways that we can even make sure that if anybody gets into your system, they don't know that you sent it to us. So if you have stuff, you know, that the documents things, please think about getting it to journalists.
So let's talk about when it comes to getting interviews from our governor, from Governor Ron DeSantis, Department of Education, making those requests. Do you find there is an open door policy and you're able to get access to those things? KATHRYN is smiling as I ask this question.
Just because my answer is so succinct, no. But again, I'm not a daily news reporter, and I am also not here in Florida. The pleasure of getting to come here, but I'm not here every day. And I think we have kind of this insight on that particular question of anybody who's up here.
It can definitely be a challenge. I have on almost every show that I've done that's a Justice for All show about education, about the new laws. We have always done our due diligence and left the door open for someone from the governor's office to join us in repeated emails and calls. And they typically fall on deaf ears. At some point today, it's 2:00 in the afternoon on a Friday, just for transparency. I will get an email from the governor's office and it will have the governor's schedule on it, but it will be about 6:00 tonight for today. And this is just being transparent. It is just the truth. So, yeah, so if in the old days, if you were covering something and maybe you were a reporter in Tallahassee and you wanted to try to get an interview from someone and you were starting at 9:00 in the morning, the thought would be maybe, you know, before I go on the air at 5:00 or 6:00, I'll have at least a statement or something from the governor's office. Typically, you would get a call back, even if it was, we're not going to comment on this and this is why. But it has been a bit of a challenge to get comment on stories. And we're just transparent. We will say, we tried to contact, we contacted several times. We've not yet heard back.
Yeah, I just really that their comment can sometimes be a powerful thing to be, you know, expressed to a community that a public official who is being paid with taxpayer dollars won't communicate with his constituents via, you know, the media.
Let's talk about access to the data, because just as you were saying, KATHRYN, a moment ago, and Kyle, you were talking about the documents, that data can help you when you're looking for trends, put together your story, and really beef it up with that information. So how are you able to get access to data? Because we know it's a critical part. And do you have challenges where doors are closed or calls are not returned when you're trying to get it? Are you just doing FOIA to get whatever it is?
Yeah, I mean, we can always FOIA, you know, put in a freedom of information request, or kind of sometimes different names in different levels of government or states. You know, you can also kind of reach out to the relevant agencies just ahead of time, see if they'll just talk to you. Sometimes they will, most of the time, yeah, they will not. I think what the challenges of dealing with data is, I mean, I think that there are ways that I've seen, like, in the reporting that I was doing on Sarasota, I was trying to just get some hard numbers for the number of teacher vacancies that were actually there at the time, because I was just hearing about this flood of educators who had had it, who just kind of almost every school board meeting, it seems like, for a year, like there was some new kind of really contentious proposal that was coming up and bringing a major change to the schools. And so I kept being told, a lot of teachers are leaving. So trying to get that information from the district, they kept sending information, but I don't know, I felt like it kept being sent in ways that were not meant to be easily understood. So I think, that can be kind of a thing, is, needing to continue to kind of go back and ask for exactly the information. Yeah, to get a specific. How about you when it comes to the data?
Yeah. So, the World Wide Web is your friend. For journalists who are in this room and or other people who want more data, one thing is tax documents, which you can find. ProPublica does an incredible job of collecting tax documents, and those are where you can find, some of these sunshine laws are work against us now. Citizens United works against us with these laws that no longer require folks to record where money is coming from, but there still is a lot of information in those, and so that's something I would suggest. Center for Media and Democracy, Source Watch, ALEC Exposed, True North, these are all unbelievable organizations that are collecting data for you. And so I highly recommend folks use them, and also be open to contacting the journalists and the investigators that are finding this information, because they really, really want you to use it. And we're very open to that. I'm working with a group of academics and journalists and writers who are trying to help journalists get this information. So we have created an email, reporting right at googlegroups.com, and that is, if you want information, if you're a journalist, you're working on a story and you need data, you need information, you want to know who's funding a group, you want to know what the group's goals are, email us. And I'm also working, I'm about to launch with this consortium a newsletter reporting right, and we are to do our best to help journalists figure out ways to get quick historical background data, sources for stories that relate to these activities on the right. Let's do a quick kind of deep dive into some of the work that you ladies have done. And I'm just going to read the headlines for these, because I think it'll give folks an idea of what some of the coverage has been. This is a story headline that KATHRYN wrote in Vanity Fair. The Florida of today is the America of tomorrow. Ron DeSantis's new college takeover is just the beginning of the right's higher ed crusade. So fill in the blanks on that story, kind of the digging, kind of the direction you went, and why.
Sure. I'm smiling because that title comes courtesy of somebody in this room. Yeah. Well, I think everybody here knows what happened with New College, and I don't need to kind of go into that part of it so much. So yeah, this was a piece I wrote for Vanity Fair in either February or March. I'm not exactly sure, actually. But yeah, I mean, part of it was looking at what was going on at New College. But part of it was also trying to put it into some larger context of, how institutions of, higher education have been being targeted You know, in part, and this was based as well on some reporting I had done the year before for Salon when I was an investigative reporter there. But looking at how the kind of state-directed establishment of kind of standalone institutions within schools, usually these days public institutions, to create these classics institutes or civics institutes, were increasingly becoming something that was really fraught with a lot of politics. You know, I'll just kind of pause to say classical education is a term that means lots of different things. And, you know, it can be expressed in a lot of different ways. And it's also a term that has been adopted by the right to describe and to elevate one form of classical education, which is kind of namely that you could see at Hillsdale College, or the ways that they're trying to, you know, make New College the Hillsdale of the South. You know, but when I talk about classical education, I kind of doing so with the knowledge that it is something broader, and yet it's also been a title that has been sort of seized and appropriated by the right. Yeah, in a Vanity Fair story and in a Salon story that I did the year before, where I dug a little bit more into those things in depth, I was looking at how the pattern of setting up standalone institutes or, you know, centers within schools, which Nancy, you know, just documented so brilliantly in her book, how that is spilling over now into public university systems, and often not just relying on private funding, but also with direct state funding, and how that's being used as a sort of a way to advance a political agenda. So in Tennessee, for example, you know, in 2022, the governor there, Bill Lee, announced that he was going to, you know, partner with Hillsdale College to create 50 new Hillsdale affiliated charter schools across the state, but he was also going to create, you know, a standalone center within the flagship school of the University of Tennessee. You know, that would be this Institute of Civics. And, you know, it was going to counter what he saw as anti-American protests going on at other schools. And there, I believe he singled out Yale student protesters there. So he was saying, we're going to create this institute that is going to be the antithesis of that. And so for me, seeing that back then, that was the first indication of like, oh, okay, like, so this is not just, you know, Hillsdale and K-12. This is kind of an effort to, you know, bring these ideas and a lot of this language, which a lot of it is based around civics, classics, or Western civilization, all terms that, you know, have, you know, neutral or even positive definitions, and all terms that have also kind of been co-opted and, you know, frozen to some degree by the right. So I was looking at what was going on at New College in kind of the broader context of the fact that, you know, these sorts of institutions have been introduced in, you know, a lot of the states where education is, you know, most imperiled, in Tennessee, in Texas, in Arizona, in Florida. So that was that story.
Tal, your book was featured in Rolling Stone, a headline here, Inside the Far Right's Fight for College Campuses. So tell us a little bit about the process and what that was about. So my book, as I said before, followed these right-wing groups. But underlying what I was doing was really trying to figure out how these right-wing ideas were being marketed to young people. And that really dovetails a lot with the work that KATHRYN does, because we do see these groups using these very anodyne terms, either for the names of their organizations, the Freedom Institute, the Intercollegiate Studies, blah, blah, whatever. There are all these names that seem like, oh, I'm for that. Oh, I like that. Moms for Liberty. Oh, I like that. I'm for parental rights. Oh, I like that. Parental. So what I was really trying to get at was how these really radical ideas were getting packaged in a nice, in a nice bow and sold to students and also sold to adults. And I think the important thing for journalists and for recovering this type of thing is not to get hoodwinked into using that terminology, so that when you describe an organization, when you're describing one of these think tanks, that you are able to quickly tell readers or listeners who is funding this, and what its real goals are, and to also not use the terminology of their campaigns. So, for example, the parental rights campaign is not about parental rights, right? And parental rights laws already exist. Many states have these parental rights laws that allow parents a lot of access to schools. So when you're covering this type of thing, it's really important that you make it clear that it's a lie, that this is some sort of new thing, and that also this isn't about parental rights. So the packaging is a lot of what I was trying to get at in my book. It's really hard when they come up with these names that sound so good. The civic centers are popping up all over colleges around the country and are creating curriculum for their colleges, but also for K through 12. They're not civic centers. Civic centers already exist on a lot of college campuses. These civic centers promote democracy. They promote voting, right? They promote participation. These civic centers that are being developed are promoting ideas around the United States of superiority, the fact that we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic, which is a whole other conversation, that the church and state actually should and are aligned. These are not ideas, civic ideas that actually fall into the category of our understanding of civics. I will say that if you are writing and you're doing this work and you're seeing and you're using the term parental rights, you are lying to your readers, right? You cannot use their terminology. You have to, monitor what's in the classroom. Those are gag orders, right? Like you have to really get out from their terminology. The names, what they call themselves, is really hard. I am still struggling with that. How do you use the name, the blah, blah, blah civic center, and how do you then describe that to your readers without having an editor say, oh, you've just editorialized. So that is a work in progress. But some of that, but just the terms that they're using, you don't need to use those, and you shouldn't. And if a copy editor is putting those in a headline, you need to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Even some of the people who are attending the school board meetings, it's important as a journalist before you interview them to ask them, do you have children that go to this school? Yeah. So it's you have to be a critical thinker and really. There are times because of deadlines, you're going to a meeting and it's a school board meeting and you're waiting for that public comment portion of the meeting and it's a hot topic, but you also have a newscast at 10 o'clock. It can be a challenge to get the people that you want to talk with, but you do have to do your due diligence to know exactly who you're talking to.
And that's where you all can be really helpful to journalists, because one of the marketing tactics is to create grassroots fronts for the organizations behind the scenes that are protecting their very personal rights, right, of their donors. So you can explain to journalists, this is not an on-the-ground grassroots group. This is a group that's actually representing these much more nefarious ideas. And giving journalists that information before they attend these meetings and giving them background and having that kind of open dialogue with them helps them, when they're on deadline, to know how to describe the group, how to describe what their agenda is.
KATHRYN?
Yeah, that's great. I love the point that you're making about language and kind of not getting suckered into using misleading or propagandistic language. And I feel like you gave some really great examples. And I feel like there's more. I mean, I think identity politics in itself, the way it has been used by the right, is kind of propagandistic language that should not be repeated without the context that what they are practicing is also a form of identity politics. We're just not recognizing it as such. Or when people say, you know, we're trying to take this identity stuff out of the classroom. No, you're not. You're just, you know, trying to return to an older status quo. But I also think, you know, you can see this happening just kind of in real time. There was just in the last couple of weeks, a hearing in Congress about a new bill in Illinois. And I have not written about this, so I'm not expert on this. But it was to, you know, new policy in Illinois to basically ban book bans. And the politician behind it kind of was called to testify to Congress. And in the kind of the panel of people who are testifying, there was also, you know, Max Eden, who is, I think he's now actually at the American Enterprise Institute, but he used to be at the Manhattan Institute. He is the person who kind of led that whole campaign in Parkland, Florida, that I was talking about before. And he has continued to be really involved in kind of right-wing education politics. And his testimony was basically, there's no book bans. You can get these books on Amazon. And that seems to me, because I've now seen that language be picked up and repeated, you know, on social media a few times. I feel like I'm starting to see, you know, some of the activist groups pick this up. You know, it is, you know, you can see kind of the next talking point start to form. You know, just as we started to see these universal voucher bills pass, I know this is a bit tangential, but you start to hear this kind of common refrain of, you know, fund the student, not the system. And you can, I think if we pay attention, we can see these things start to emerge and recognize that these are organized talking points. These are organized campaigns. We don't need to buy into it. So I think that was a really good point to raise.
Yeah, and the book ban thing, you know, it's funny that you said that, because I was reading an article recently about this, you know, this talking point that in this, you know, this the promoter of book bans was saying this is not a book ban, and this was quoted, and it just sat there. It sat there in this article, like as if that was a legitimate position. It's a lie. It's an absolute lie, and that's the type of thing that you cannot accept, and that's when you're complicit as a journalist, when you just promote quotes that are lies. So that's and further, and this is something else, is what these guys do is they tell you, they lie to you about what's happening, and then they tell you that what they're doing is fixing what's happening, right? So this idea that there's no civic centers, we're creating civic centers. So what a good journalist needs to do is to make clear in every article, we already have a civic center on this campus, right? This is the new civic center, you know, our college already has. This idea that, you know, we, you know, what is exactly, anyway, that's, yeah, that.
Newsrooms, it is important to have guidelines and provide context in every single story. And then no matter the deadline, maybe we have to hold this until later, until we can go in and get the correct context. It's important. So I've been asking all of these questions, but we want to make sure that you all have an opportunity to ask these questions. And I know that you guys just had lunch, probably a heavy lunch, but wake up and get ready to ask some questions, because it is not often you get an opportunity to
interview the interviewers. So really take this opportunity to ask questions and keep it real, like the questions that you have of journalists. If you ever throw the shoe at the TV or you take the news, am I the only person that still gets a newspaper? If you wrangle with the newspaper and throw it over your shoulder or magazine, this is your opportunity to ask the interviewers questions. There's a question way up there. What's the process? Do they need to write it down? I know you want them to say their name and who they're with.
Yeah, and you can just introduce yourself, but then also because we're kind of running a little bit late, we're just going to ask if people can keep their questions a little brief. But I'm going to try and jump around to get to all of you. Just 1 second.
Who will be the next person to ask a question? Okay, great.
Thanks so much for this. My name is Juliana Paré-Vagoyev. I'm a faculty member at Hopkins, speaking as a private citizen. I'm also an alum of New College, and I've jumped into the space that you've all been. So, in the last 7 months, I became aware, right, of the kinds of things that you've been writing and thinking about for a long time. One of the things I didn't necessarily hear you speak about, and I'm curious about, is the way that organizations like the Leadership Institute and the Family Policy Alliance reflect what ALEC is doing for state legislatures, but they're doing it in the space of school boards. And I'm curious about your thoughts on that and the way that Turning Point USA is doing the same thing, but for student government at colleges.
You'd like to take that?
I think I do. Yeah. And I can definitely speak a bit to Leadership Institute, and I think you are the reigning expert probably on TPUSA. But that's a great question. Yeah, I saw some of that firsthand when it comes to the Leadership Institute, because I was reporting on Sarasota, where the current school board chair, Bridget Ziegler, is now, I'm not sure if I'm going to get the title exactly correct, but I think it's Director of School Board Programs for the Leadership Institute. And if folks don't know, the Leadership Institute is this really long-standing right-wing organization that exists basically to train other conservatives to be activists, to be leaders in different fields. And so when they basically kind of created this whole new focus on school boards, that's a pretty significant sign. It's, them saying, we're used to doing kind of training grassroots conservative activists, and we're used to doing trainings for, people who are going to work in different ways in government. But yeah, now they have this program where they are just, in part flying Bridget Ziegler around the country. And, she is school board chair of Sarasota's district. Her spouse is also the head of the Florida State Republican Party. She is also on the board that oversees Disney and has been kind of, tussling with Disney for the last 9 months or so. But yeah, they've been flying her around the country to go train, either newly elected school board members or school board candidates. Here's how you can kind of launch your own right-wing school board revolution. But they've also set up this new center right in the middle of Sarasota, where, 6,000 square foot center where they have started, just drawing school board members and candidates from around the nation to come for these trainings, and, putting them in the same room with right-wing education activists like James Lindsay, for example. So that is, that's absolutely something that's happening. And I think, just one indication of all of the infrastructure that's involved in this and that is behind this. Thanks for that smart question.
Thank you, KATHRYN. I think there's a question right here. If you're going to ask a question, will you raise your hand so we can make sure we can get you? The guy in the blue shirt was second. So can you get it to him? And then when you get your hand up, so we'll know who to go to next, we want to have you prepped and ready to go. And then also, we probably don't have any time for everyone. I'm sorry. That's a great time for coffee break conversations. We'll probably have room for one more question, I think.
David Messenger, University of South Alabama. A lot of this campaigning by right-wing groups involves misinformation, and especially in education around critical race theory. I mean, in Alabama, we had a guy who wrote a book on critical race theory. It was clear he didn't understand it. Lots of this misinformation comes from people who call themselves journalists. So I was what I think are real journalists. What is your view of this, or how do you?
Can I please answer this one?
How do you in your industry deal with those people who are claiming this too?
Clay, and let's see if we get one more person, please. You pick. At least for TV stations, and my TV station and network specifically, we have guidelines. Guidelines mean we have talked about how we're covering this story. Here in the state of Florida, you have never had instruction K through 12 where you have taught critical race theory. Every time CRT comes in a script and something I have to read, it is in there every single time. We never say critical race theory ever. You say it in the soundbite. I make sure to put the disclaimer in there. If it's not in there, I'm sending it back. I'm not putting the story on until y'all clean this up and send it back to me. It's simple. It's very simple. They might have different takes on it, but I'm just saying that is how we do it. Once we find out the information, we made the phone calls ourselves to find out in every 9 of the school districts we cover. Is anybody teaching? No, 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 no. So that's our disclaimer.
Yeah, I mean, this is the tactic that the right uses. And I think someone brought this up, is they create a framework that's false, and then you're discussing inside the framework. So you got to get out of that. And that's what you do when you have a disclaimer. You say, we're not in this framework because this is a made up framework. And that's what more journalists need to be doing. And I think the thing that's great about what you're saying is you've got to do it with your editors. You've got to do it as a journalism community. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Valerie Duran. I'm a student at Flagler College. I major in psychology, philosophy, and religion. And as an undergraduate researcher, a lot of times I deal with the two-sidism that you mentioned. I was wondering how you go about people countering that in a respectful manner. I often find it's difficult to retain ethos when it comes to that, because really the other side tends to be something so unfathomably ridiculous that it's hard to address it in a way that will actually get through to the people who are opposing me. I was wondering if you have any advice on how to handle that.
I'll let either of you take that. I feel like in a way you answered that.
Yeah. I mean, I think you don't have to, if somebody says I'm anti-democratic and I don't believe in free speech, I think the response is, we have Constitution, we have laws, we are a land of, supposedly free speech. So I think you reject the premise that that tyranny is a position.
I think there was a panelist who raised their hand. You don't get to ask a question. Then there was someone over here on the left. And what was your question? Can you say it quickly? Because I want to keep with the time.
About this notion that this is shocking or new. It's always been a part of, the American story. And also this notion that, they're playing outside of the box. They're trying to blow up democracy. I just wonder the extent to which it has ever been about democracy. It's always been sort of packaged in neat ways like civilization or liberty, democracy. I mean, I don't see how this is different.
Those are those labels that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Nancy was saying this, and I think we all know this, right? This is not new. We should have known this was going to happen. They have been teeing this up for years and years and years. And I think that psychologically, humans, when there's something that is too challenging to actually intake, will not intake it. And I think that's what happened. I think that's also what happened with Trump. They are continuing to tee up, and I want to make a really quick comment about teeing up. To the teachers out there, the K through 12 teachers who can't fight back. You can't fight back because you don't have tenure. You don't have tenure because they created that in 2011 so that now you can't fight back, right? Like they set all this up and they are continuing to set up these more, these situations in which we lose our rights. And the way that you fight that is your vote and getting government officials who understand your side in office. You can talk, we can do, unions protect you, and unions get empowered by leaders in office who believe in union representation.
All right. Kyle,
I'm not talking.
Catherine, you've done great. They're going to kick us off the stage anyway. Thank you all for listening and being a part of this session. And thank you for all of your great questions. If you are a panelist and didn't get to ask your question, you know that they will answer your question later. So